You're watching the 2025 International Chopin Competition. This is stage 2, and believe it or not, this is not the first Chopin competition. In fact, about 100 years ago on a train, Jerzy first conceived of this competition after overhearing some gentlemen talking about the Olympics. And here we are 19 editions later, and we're hearing so many incredible pianists from around the world play the music of Chopin. And I'm really lucky to be joined today by Joanna Bokszczanin and Artur Szklener. Artur Szklener is the director of the Chopin competition, executive director, and Joanna Bokszczanin is the head of the competition office. We're going to have a wonderful conversation today about the history of the competition and some of its changes, in particular the repertoire, some of the jury regulations with respect to this competition. But first, let's get to know a little bit the history of this competition and its evolution in its form. The history of the Chopin competition begins in 1927, the year when Professor Jerzy initiated the organization of the first international Frédéric Chopin piano competition. Today, 2 years before its centenary, it stands among the world's oldest and most prestigious music competitions. In the years before the Second World War, the competition was held every 5 years at the Warsaw Philharmonic. The war interrupted preparations for the 4th edition, the auditions for which were eventually postponed to the centenary of the patron's death in 1949. Because the Philharmonic had been destroyed, an exception was made and the pianists performed at the Roma Theatre. The competition returned to the Warsaw Philharmonic Hall in 1955 when it reopened after reconstruction and was raised to the rank of the National Philharmonic of Poland. Since 1970, the competition has been held in October, yet that was not always the case. With the exception of 1949, which marked the centenary of the composer's death, the competitions were scheduled for the turn of February and March, close to his birthday, and the first edition lasted from January 23rd to 30th. Only in 1970 was the date set in October, not so much to observe the composer's death anniversary as to spare performers the ordeals of the Polish winter. In 1975, another tradition took root: performances of Mozart's Requiem on October 17th, the anniversary of Chopin's death. It is a symbolic homage to the composer's last wish for Mozart's work to be performed at his funeral mass at the Church of La Madeleine in Paris. The structure of the competition has also varied over time. Each of the 3 pre-Second World War editions was held in just 2 stages. The third was added after the war, and the additional 4th stage was introduced during the 7th edition in 1965, becoming a permanent feature only in 1975, the year Christian Zimmermann won first prize. With growing interest in the competition, in 1995, applicants were first required to include a video recording with their submission, which 10 years later was complemented by live preliminary auditions. Already at the second competition in 1932, the number of applicants exceeded 200, of which 89 pianists from 18 countries performed before the public, compared with 26 pianists from 8 countries in 1927. The current 2025 edition has attracted 642 pianists, winnowed to 171 representatives of 27 countries admitted to the preliminary round, with 84 pianists from 17 countries taking part in the first stage. From the very first edition, pianists have appeared in the final with orchestra to perform one of Chopin's piano concertos. In 1995, one of the composer's earlier works for piano and orchestra was added to the program, but the practice was later abandoned. This year, the final round will once again be expanded, with competitors preceding the concerto by performing the Polonaise Fantasy, Opus 61, a work first introduced into the competition repertoire in 1937. Mazurkas have always been a fixed element of the competition repertoire, and a special prize has been awarded for their performance since the first edition in 1927. It is worth noting that this prize was not awarded twice in the competition's history. In 1990, when no winner was named, and the highest distinction, second place, went to Kevin Kinner, and 5 years later, when the top prize was again withheld. The finals of the second competition in 1932 also went down in history, as the first prize was to have been awarded jointly to 2 pianists, Alexander Uniński and Imre Ungar. However, after one of them protested, the winner was decided by drawing lots. The first post-war competition in 1949 was preceded by special training camps and preparatory courses for Polish entrants, and a separate national qualifying round for Stage 1. Interestingly, to ensure transparency and anonymity, for the first and as yet only time, the pianists, identified by numbers rather than names, performed behind a screen. The first prize was shared by Halina Czerny-Stefanska of Poland and Bela Dawidowicz of the USSR. The 1960 competition boasted the largest ever jury, with Arthur Rubinstein as its honorary chairman. The winner was Maurizio Pollini. In 1965, the jury moved from the stage of the Philharmonic Hall to the balcony, a vantage point they still occupy today. The winner 5 years later, in 1970, was the American Garrick Olson. That year also saw the first non-Polish chairman of the jury. In 2005, for the first time, the entire competition, all stages and all final concerts, was broadcast on radio, television, and online in a breakthrough opening of the competition to a global audience participating in real time. Of course, Chopin wrote a lot of music, and if you're going to have a Chopin competition, you have to decide what the competitors are actually going to play to show off their artistry and, in particular, their sense of style when it comes to Chopin. So that brings me to my first question for you, Joanna. What kinds of repertoire changes have been made in the specifications for this particular competition, the 19th edition this year?
During this year of the competition, we decided to introduce some significant changes to the repertoire, and we decided to do it from the very beginning of the competition. I mean, from the first phase of the competition, from the qualification phase, based on a DVD recording. The part of this DVD recording required at this moment was the performance of 6 preludes. It was something new for this edition of the Chopin competition. These changes also were during the preliminary round. Participants of the preliminary round had to perform one of 4 scherzos. It was also something new. But of course, the main and the most significant changes were introduced to the main phase of the October competition. In the first round, which has already been ended, the pianists taking part in this round had to perform one of 3 selected waltzes. Usually the waltzes were required in the next stages of the competition. We decided to move this obligatory waltz to the first stage. They had also to perform only one of the most difficult etudes from 5 selected and marked in the regulations. The participants also performed one of ballad, which they could exchange with barcarola or fantasy. In the second round, we also introduced some changes. The most important is that pianists will have to perform 6 of preludes. And one, of course, of Polonaise selected and marked in the regulations. And I think that what was already mentioned many times, the most significant change was made in the final of the competition. The pianist who will be the finalist of the competition will perform not only the piano concerto, one of piano concerto, but also one of the most demanding solo work of Frédéric Chopin, Polonaise Fantasy.
I'm curious about a couple of the details, Artur, if you're willing to follow up. I know in the preliminary round, the ballades that were required were either the second or the third, if I'm not mistaken. Is that correct? Was that deliberately chosen because there's so many first and fourth ballades, or what was the sort of rationale behind that choice?
Actually, the main argument for this choice was that the most frequently chosen piece during the Chopin competition is the last ballad, the fourth one. Mm-hmm. And we wanted the participants to show that they also have got in their repertoire other ballads. We all know that a ballad is really a very special genre for Chopin because it's based actually, although most of Chopin music has got this feature, but in the ballads it's a kind of their nature, the narrativeness of music that is without any words. So it's really very important. It was really very important for us to observe, and also obviously for the jury members and for the commissions to get to know the candidates from this perspective. And this particular selection of the two middle ballads was because of the fact that they are a bit less frequently chosen for the very competition.
It was very interesting because we heard obviously more of them, I think, as a result of that, which was refreshing in a way, as much as I would love to hear the fourth ballade played many times. But we will hear it because, as you said, people program it later in the second and third rounds anyway. It's such a favorite piece of so many pianists.
I think that these kinds of effects that young artists are influenced and their opinions about Chopin's music are influenced a bit by our changes in the program. You also showed in your other talks here that was very inspiring for me when the young artists were saying, for instance, about the Polonaise fantasy, because we know the history of this piece, that it was first actually rejected by the words of the pianists and also the theoreticians. Most of them were saying that this piece is obviously brilliant in terms of complexity, but it was spoken to be weird,
formally
even
confused, and
even
that's
ill. That Chopin's illness
sick,
was sick. Yeah. So when we now observe that the young artists who didn't have this piece in their repertoire got convinced, and they say now that it's their favorite piece.
I've heard a lot of pianists say that this is now their favorite piece.
It's really something. I think that it's really encouraging to do things like that.
Also to hear preludes again required. Joanna, we were talking earlier about, we're trying to remember when was the last time we heard so many preludes, but actually in the two previous competitions there was an option in the third round. And it occurred to me, because we're hearing Eric Liu once again, who was a laureate in 2015, but he didn't play a sonata that year. He played the 24 preludes. Can you talk a little bit about that previous option and I guess what we have in its place this year?
Well, we decided that sonata should be an obligatory piece at the competition.
So everyone must play a sonata this year?
Yes, this is obligatory piece in the third round. So of course pianists still can play the whole set of preludes. They can do it, for example, in the second round.
And many are.
Yes, yes. So.
But otherwise, just to clarify, they have three options of groups of 6 from the 24 preludes, which, if you do the math, that means there's a group of 6, which we'll say has some lighter or less technically demanding overall, the first 6, basically. Of course, they're still extremely challenging. But I'd say, is this part of the reasoning behind making the requirement either 7 through 12, 13 through 18, 19 through 24? Each of those has a almost etude-like piece as part of them. So everyone is sort of equalized if they choose any of those 3.
I think that it's because Chopin was sequencing the preludes, usually just setting them with a contrast, some kind of contrast. So if we've got 6 of them, we've got all types of them all together. So some of them are like etudes, very short etudes, very demanding, very speedy. Some of them are like little arias. Only a few of them are a bit bigger in form. But what was really important for us, and it was since 2015, actually the competition in 2015, that we wanted to give an opportunity to the participants to perform the whole set, because we think that it's really some a kind of miracle in the words of the pianistic output, and it's seen not earlier. If you just have a selection of them, you cannot have this impression.
Right.
But the most difficult challenge was to combine that attitude with the fact that the sonata form is also very important. And I don't want to just, yeah.
Yes, I just wanted to add, because we had some idea at the beginning, if you remember, that we also consider to put the whole set of preludes to the final.
That was one of the ideas for this competition.
Yes, it was our initial idea for how to introduce very significant changes to the competition.
Well, it's very interesting, and of course, the second and third sonatas are often the only ones you see pianists record. We are hearing two interpretations of the first sonata here in the second round as freely chosen repertoire. I think Hyo Lee and Kaimin Chan, if I'm not mistaken. You wouldn't include those among the required sonatas, though, because it's such a different work. Is that sort of the reasoning behind that? You want the two mature sonatas to be the sort of mandatory choices, correct?
Honestly speaking, I think that they are much better for the participants because I had this kind of feeling during the previous competitions that when sonatas were not obligatory, some of the pianists who have chosen to perform all of the preludes lost some opportunity of showing their maturity and their ability of showing the classical sequence, the classical sonata, not form, but for movements. And we just didn't want participants to risk that. And we know actually that some of them have chosen to do it other way around. So to play sonata, the B-flat minor sonata in the second round as a free work,
right?
Just not to lose this opportunity of showing sonata to the jury members and to the public. So we thought how to combine that to allow participants playing both, and that's the result of this competition.
I'd love to move to the topic of jury regulations, and of course it's a competition, so the jury is always, I think, a mystery for a lot of viewers. I mean, they're not necessarily reading the rule book, so maybe you can talk a little bit about if there's any new or different jury regulations, or just generally discuss the jury process.
Yeah, there is one change that is very significant in comparison to the previous competitions, because we had a very complex system that was actually overlapping two different kinds of system. One was yes, no, and the second one was just points from 0 to 25. And the jury members had to put both. And there were many issues in synchronization, in making the threshold lines and things like that.
Because the jury utilizes the yes-no in different ways. Each one, they strategically decide yes-no with different ideas of what number between 25 it might be. So it was just, the math got probably very complicated.
And quite often we had the situation that somebody who had lower number of years figures had the bigger score. So we didn't know actually what to do with that. If we as jury members and as organizers were lucky, then we were extending a bit the list of participants who were allowed to the next round, but not always it was possible. So our idea was to simplify that, and now we stick only to the scoring system. So now basically the jury members need to give a figure for each participant from 0 to 25. And what we also introduced, and it was being changed among the different editions of the competition, was the idea if the scorings should influence the next stages. So in other words, if the jury member gave somebody a scoring for the first round, should they remember that and include that in their calculations for the next rounds themselves? Or if system should do that. And this time we introduced a kind of recalculating by the system. So
then each jury member doesn't have to worry how they scored before. They're just evaluating what they're hearing right now
That's the idea.
And then the system takes care of the cumulative process.
Exactly, that's the idea. Generally, we divide that, so we try to keep the previous rounds as 30% of the ratio, and the most frequent round as 70%, and then we recalculate everything.
And is there any mandate or just overarching guideline that's issued to the jury about what they're looking for exactly? Any kind of criteria, or is it really just left open?
This is actually left open if we are talking about the regulations. We know that, especially for the competition as the 19th Chopin's competition, where the overall level, artistic level, is really very high in terms of the pianism. So all of the participants actually are great artists already. So they can perform on most of the stages all over the world with great success. So the jury members have got much more demanding task because they need to go down to stylistic opinions. So opinions about how accurate some performance was in terms of what they understand as a correct Chopin's style. And obviously we know that there isn't a kind of a clear definition of the Chopin style. It's really a very complex task, a very complex subject. So there will be always some differences in their interpretation.
It's good to keep it that way, because if it were too much like figure skating at the Olympics, and there are actual criteria for how one should spin or twirl, right? And it's like, oh, we're looking for this kind of rubato, 9 out of 10, or that would somehow go against the spirit of interpretation of these works, this problem of subjectivity, a topic that's probably too large for this particular set, but this is fascinating, and I hope we can continue the discussion at some point later. This has been really wonderful. These Chopin talks are great, by the way. I hope we can hang out as much as possible on this set. What does everyone at home think? It's been, already just about a week into the competition, and we've heard a lot of these new repertoire changes, and the jury is going through its process. So it's really interesting what people around the world are watching and how they're feeling about it. But here there's so much excitement, and I must say, just from the inside, it's an incredible experience to be here and to be part of this history, about a century in now, almost reaching the centenary. So with that, we should continue with the music. So we're going to go back to the hall now and continue listening to the next competitors of Stage 2 of the International Chopin Competition. Thank you so much to Artur Szklener, Joanna Bokszczanin, and back to the show.